You know that sweet, blissful moment when you're deep in sleep, dreaming about winning the lottery or finally telling your boss what you really think of their team-building exercises? Yeah, that was me until it wasn't. At exactly 3:07 a.m., I was yanked out of my slumber by a knock so aggressive it could have been auditioning for a role in a crime drama. For a second, I thought it was an earthquake. Nope, just Karen. Let me set the stage here. My name's Jack, and I live in the kind of suburban neighborhood where the grass is always green. Because if it isn't, you'll get fined, and everyone pretends to like each other at block parties while secretly judging your choice of mulch. It's HOA territory, Homeowners Association for the Uninitiated, which basically means a group of self-appointed neighborhood overlords gets to decide what shade of beige your house can be and whether your mailbox is aesthetically pleasing. Spoiler alert, mine isn't. Anyway, back to Karen. Karen is our HOA president, and if you've ever wondered what happens when someone with too much free time and a god complex gets a clipboard, well, meet Karen. She's the kind of person who sends out emails with subject lines like, urgent, unauthorized garden gnomes spotted on Elm Street, and genuinely believes she's single-handedly preserving property values by policing everyone's trash can placement. And tonight, she had decided that my driveway, my private driveway, was her battleground. I stumbled to the door in my pajamas, half blind without my glasses, and opened it to find Karen standing there with her signature scowl. Behind her were two police officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but here. One was rubbing his temples like he had an HOA-induced migraine, and the other was staring at his notepad as if hoping it would magically transport him to a donut shop. Jack, Karen began, her voice dripping with the kind of self-righteousness only someone who's memorized the HOA bylaws could muster. I've asked you nicely to move your truck so my guests can park in your driveway. Now, let me clarify something. My truck wasn't parked illegally. It wasn't blocking anyone's view or violating any HOA rules. It was sitting snugly in my driveway because, brace yourself for this revelation, it's my driveway. But apparently, Karen had decided that her soiree was more important than my basic property rights. Karen, I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fact that I was standing barefoot on cold concrete at an ungodly hour. I'm not moving my truck. Your guests can park on the street like normal people. She gasped as if I just suggested we burn down the community gazebo. The street? She exclaimed. Do you have any idea how inconvenient that is for them? They're VIPs. VIPs? In our neighborhood? Unless Oprah had suddenly decided to swing by for wine and cheese night, I highly doubted it. At this point, one of the officers cleared his throat. Ma'am, he said, addressing Karen with the kind of tone reserved for people who call 911 over fast food disputes. This doesn't appear to be an emergency. Karen turned to him with wide eyes. Not an emergency? Officer, this man is obstructing community harmony. He's being difficult. Difficult. That's Karen speak for not doing exactly what I want. The officer sighed and looked at me. Sir, he said wearily, is there any way you could move your truck just to resolve this peacefully? I crossed my arms. With all due respect, officer, no. This is my property. I'm not breaking any laws or HOA rules. Karen interjected before he could respond. But it's rude, and against the spirit of our community guidelines. Ah yes, the infamous spirit clause, the vague catch-all excuse HOAs use when they can't actually point to a real rule you're violating. If I had $1 for every time Karen invoked it, I could afford to move to a neighborhood without an HOA. The second officer finally spoke up, clearly fed up with the whole ordeal. Ma'am, he said to Karen, you called us out here at 3 a.m. over a parking issue that isn't even illegal? Karen puffed up like an angry rooster. It's not just about parking. It's about respect. People like him are why this neighborhood is going downhill. People like me? Oh no, Karen wasn't going to get away with that one. People like me? I shot back. You mean people who follow the rules but don't bow down to your every whim? Sorry if I don't fit into your step-forward fantasy. The officers exchanged glances that screamed, why did we sign up for this job? One of them pulled out his notepad and started scribbling something down. What are you writing? Karen demanded. A report, he replied flatly, for wasting police resources. Her jaw dropped so fast I thought it might hit the ground. She turned back to me with a glare that could have melted steel. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming off into the night like some kind of suburban villain retreating to her lair. The officers apologized for disturbing me and left shortly after her dramatic exit. As I closed the door and trudged back to bed, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Only in HOA land could refusing to move your own truck turn into a midnight police visit. And as much as I wanted to go back to sleep and forget this nonsense ever happened, one thing was clear. Karen had declared war and she'd picked the wrong guy to mess with. Let me tell you something about living in an HOA neighborhood. At first glance, it seems like paradise. Perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and neighbors who wave at you while walking their designer dogs. But peel back the beige paint and you'll find the truth. It's a dystopian nightmare disguised as suburban bliss. And Karen? Karen is the dictator of this tiny kingdom. Now, I didn't move here because I wanted to live under HOA rule. I moved here because the house was affordable, close to work, and had a driveway big enough to park my truck without having to play musical chairs with street parking. What I didn't realize was that signing those HOA documents was basically like signing your soul away. You know that stack of papers they give you at closing? The ones no one reads because they're written in legalese so dense it might as well be hieroglyphics? Yeah, buried in there are rules so specific they make the IRS tax code look like light reading. For example, did you know that in my neighborhood, you can't have more than 3 lawn ornaments? Or that your trash cans have to be hidden from view at all times, even on trash day? And don't even think about painting your house any color other than approved neutral. I once heard a guy got fined because his Christmas lights were too bright. Too bright. As if holiday cheer is some kind of crime. But back to Karen. After her midnight stunt with the cops, I started paying closer attention to her antics. You see, Karen doesn't just enforce the rules. She lives for them. She's like a walking HOA handbook with a superiority complex. She patrols the neighborhood daily, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on any perceived violation. If your grass is half an inch too long or your car tires touch the curb instead of your driveway, she'll send you a letter faster than you can say, property value. And these aren't just friendly reminders. Oh no, Karen's letters are masterpieces of passive aggression. They always start with something like, "Dear neighbor," as if she's trying to convince you she cares about you personally. Then she'll hit you with phrases like, "It has come to my attention," or "in the spirit of maintaining our community standards," followed by a detailed list of your sins and a thinly veiled threat about fines or legal action. It's like getting scolded by your mom, but with legal jargon. I've received my fair share of these letters over the years. There was the time she accused me of unauthorized landscaping because I planted tomatoes in my backyard instead of flowers. Or the time she tried to fine me for leaving my recycling bin out an hour past pickup time. An hour. But her latest crusade against my truck was a new low. After the police incident, Karen doubled down on her campaign to make my life miserable. She started sending me letters claiming my truck was unsightly and detrimental to community aesthetics. Unsightly? It's a perfectly normal truck. It's not covered in rust or missing doors. It's just big because I use it for work. But apparently, Karen thinks anything bigger than a Prius is an eyesore. She even tried to argue that my truck violated HOA rules about commercial vehicles. Now, I've read those rules, yes. I finally dug out that stack of closing documents. And they specifically say that commercial vehicles can't be parked in driveways overnight unless they're used for personal transportation, which mine is. Nice try, Karen. Of course, she didn't stop there. She started showing up unannounced during the day while I was at work, taking photos of my driveway like some kind of suburban paparazzi. One time, she even knocked on my door while I was eating dinner just to lecture me about how my truck was ruining the neighborhood vibe. Ruining the vibe? Lady, this isn't Beverly Hills. It's a middle-class suburb with cookie-cutter houses and kids riding scooters on sidewalks. But here's where things get interesting. Karen isn't exactly squeaky clean herself. You see, when someone spends all their time pointing fingers at everyone else, it's only a matter of time before people start looking at them more closely. And what do you know? Karen has her own little HOA skeletons in the closet. For starters, her backyard fence is 2 inches taller than HOA regulations allow. Not that anyone cares except her. She also has this hideous bird bath shaped like a giant seashell that definitely exceeds the 3-ornament limit. And let's not forget her dog, a yappy little chihuahua named Princess, that she lets roam off-leash despite HOA rules requiring pets to be restrained at all times. Now, I'm not saying I went out of my way to investigate these violations, but let's just say I started paying closer attention after her midnight stunt with the cops. And once I noticed them, well, let's just say Karen wasn't ready for what came next. I decided it was time for some good old-fashioned suburban justice. So one afternoon while she was busy patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard, I snapped a few photos of her backyard fence and seashell bird bath from the sidewalk. Perfectly legal. Thank you very much. Then I sent an anonymous email to the HOA board pointing out her violations and asking if exceptions were being made for certain residents. The fallout was glorious. At the next HOA meeting, which Karen runs like it's Congress, one of the board members brought up her fence height and bird bath during open discussion. You should have seen her face when they asked if she planned to bring them into compliance. She stammered something about how they were grandfathered in, they weren't, and tried to change the subject. But everyone knew she'd been caught red-handed. And Princess? Well, let's just say several neighbors suddenly started filing complaints about off-leash dogs after seeing mine mysteriously disappear from their inboxes. Karen didn't take kindly to being called out on her hypocrisy. And honestly, that made it all worth it. Because if there's one thing worse than living under an HOA dictatorship, it's living under an HOA dictatorship run by someone who doesn't follow their own rules. So yeah, welcome to HOA hell, where petty power struggles reign supreme and revenge is best served with a side of passive aggression. And trust me when I say this, Karen may have declared war on me, but she hasn't seen anything yet. Now, you'd think that after getting called out on her own HOA violations, Karen might take a step back, reevaluate her life choices, maybe even, dare I say, chill out. But no, Karen doesn't do chill. Instead, she doubled down on what I can only describe as the most ridiculous campaign of suburban vengeance I've ever witnessed. It was like watching a bad reality TV show unfold in real time. Except instead of flipping tables, Karen was flipping through HOA bylaws looking for new ways to ruin my life. The first salvo in her war against me came in the form of yet another letter. This one was hand-delivered to my mailbox because apparently Karen thinks stamps are for peasants, and written in her signature passive-aggressive style. It started with, "Dear Jack," which is funny because I'm pretty sure Karen doesn't know the meaning of the word dear. Then it launched into a tirade about how my truck was setting a precedent for non-compliance and undermining community standards. She even included a photocopy of the HOA rules with the section on vehicle parking highlighted in neon yellow, as if I hadn't already memorized it during our last battle. But here's the kicker. At the bottom of the letter, she added a personal note in cursive so fancy it looked like she'd borrowed it from a wedding invitation. It said, "I trust you'll do the right thing for our neighborhood." The right thing. As if moving my truck would somehow save us all from descending into chaos and anarchy. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it into my recycling bin. Because unlike Karen, I actually care about the environment and went about my day. But that wasn't enough for her. Oh no. Karen's next move was to escalate things to the HOA board. She filed an official complaint against me, claiming my truck was a commercial vehicle causing visual pollution. Visual pollution. As if my driveway had suddenly become a toxic waste site because of one perfectly normal pickup truck. Now, let me explain how HOA complaints work. When someone files one, the board has to review it and decide whether to take action. And since Karen is not only on the board but practically runs it like her own personal fiefdom, she made sure my complaint got top priority. They scheduled a special meeting just to discuss it, because apparently debating the aesthetics of my truck is more important than fixing potholes or addressing actual issues in the neighborhood. At this point, I knew I had to fight back. So I did what any rational person would do when faced with HOA tyranny. I lawyered up. Well, sort of. My cousin Steve isn't technically a lawyer. He's a paralegal who spends most of his time drafting wills for elderly clients. But he knows his way around legal documents and has a knack for finding loopholes. Plus, he works cheap, as in free, which is exactly what my budget could handle. Steve helped me prepare a defense based on the HOA bylaws themselves. We combed through every page looking for anything that might counter Karen's claims. And guess what? We found it. Turns out there's a clause that specifically states vehicles used for personal transportation are exempt from commercial vehicle restrictions, even if they're big enough to make Karen's Prius look like a toy car. Armed with this knowledge, I showed up to the HOA meeting ready to defend myself. The room was packed with neighbors who'd been dragged there by Karen's incessant emails about preserving community harmony. She was sitting at the head of the table like some kind of suburban queen bee, flanked by her loyal minions who nodded along to everything she said. Karen started by presenting her case against me with all the drama of a courtroom scene from Law and Order. She had photos of my truck blown up to poster size, as if its mere existence was some kind of crime against humanity. She talked about how its industrial appearance was eroding property values and making residents uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? Lady, it's a truck, not a haunted house. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly pointed out the clause Steve had found and explained how my truck didn't violate any rules. Then I added, if we're going to start policing what's unsightly, maybe we should talk about certain backyard fences and oversized bird baths. The room went dead silent except for a few muffled chuckles from neighbors who clearly knew what I was referring to. Karen's face turned redder than her favorite shade of lipstick. She tried to argue that her bird bath was an exception because it enhanced community aesthetics. But no one seemed convinced, especially not after someone brought up Princess running off-leash again. In the end, the board voted in my favor. My truck stayed right where it belonged, in my driveway, and Karen stormed out of the meeting muttering something about standard slipping. Now, you'd think that would be the end of it, but no. Karen doesn't know how to quit while she's behind. Over the next few weeks, she started pulling petty stunts that were so ridiculous they bordered on comedy. One morning, I woke up to find flyers taped to every mailbox in the neighborhood warning residents about the dangers of non-compliance. They featured a stock photo of an abandoned junkyard, which is hilarious considering our neighborhood looks like something out of Better Homes and Gardens. Another time, she tried to organize a petition demanding stricter rules on vehicle parking, but barely anyone signed it because most people were too busy laughing at her antics. And then there was her piece de resistance. She hired some guy with a clipboard, clearly trying to mimic herself, to walk around measuring driveways and taking notes on potential violations. He showed up at my house one afternoon while I was mowing the lawn and asked if he could measure mine for research purposes. I told him he could measure his chances of getting off my property before I turned on the sprinklers. At this point, even Karen's loyal followers were starting to question her sanity. People began avoiding her during her patrols and unsubscribing from her email updates faster than you can say unsubscribe. It was like watching an empire crumble under its own weight, and honestly, couldn't have happened to a more deserving dictator. So there you have it, Karen's spiraling campaign of chaos, a masterclass in how not to run an HOA dictatorship. And while she may have declared war on me, all she really accomplished was turning herself into the neighborhood punchline. So, after Karen's petition flopped, her clipboard guy got chased off my lawn, and her flyers became neighborhood recycling fodder. You'd think she'd finally throw in the towel, right? Wrong. Karen doesn't throw in towels. She folds them neatly, labels them with a color-coded system, and files them under community standards. And if she can't win by sheer force of will, she'll escalate. Which is exactly what happened next. It was a quiet Thursday evening. Well, quiet for everyone except Karen. I was sitting on my porch enjoying a cold beer and the sweet sound of nothing when I noticed her pacing up and down the street like a general preparing for battle. She had her phone glued to her ear and was gesturing wildly at random houses as if she were plotting an invasion. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just mad anymore. She was strategizing. And whatever she was planning, it wasn't going to be good. Sure enough, the next morning I woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA board. Well, technically it was from Karen, but she'd slapped the HOA logo on it to make it look official. The notice claimed that my truck was now under review for violating updated community guidelines, and that I had 14 days to rectify the situation or face fines. Updated guidelines? Oh, Karen. This was next-level nonsense. I grabbed the notice and marched straight to my computer. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. You see, what Karen didn't realize is that I'd been doing some research of my own. Turns out there's this magical thing called state law, and it trumps HOA rules every time. Specifically, there's a law in my state that protects homeowners from being fined for vehicles parked in their own driveways, as long as they're not abandoned or leaking oil all over the place, which mine definitely wasn't. Armed with this knowledge, I fired off an email to the HOA board citing the law and demanding they retract their bogus notice. Now, here's where things get interesting. Karen didn't just ignore my email. She doubled down. 2 days later, I came home to find not one but 2 orange notices taped to my door. One was identical to the first. The other claimed that my lawn was not up to community standards because it had visible patches of discoloration. Discoloration. Lady, it's grass, not a Monet painting. At this point, I knew Karen wasn't going to stop until someone put her in her place. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. And by that, I mean I called a lawyer. A real one this time. Not Cousin Steve, bless his heart. Enter Lisa, a no-nonsense attorney who specializes in HOA disputes and has a reputation for making HOA presidents cry during depositions. Lisa took one look at Karen's notices and said, "Oh yeah, we've got her. First things first." Lisa sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA board demanding they stop harassing me over my truck and lawn. She included citations from state law and threatened legal action if they didn't comply. Then she filed an official complaint with the state housing authority, accusing Karen of abusing her position as HOA president for personal gain. And just for good measure, she CC'd every member of the HOA board on both documents. Because if there's one thing Karen hates more than losing control, it's being publicly called out. The fallout was glorious. Within days of Lisa's letter hitting their inboxes, several board members started distancing themselves from Karen faster than rats abandoning a sinking ship. One even emailed me privately to apologize for any inconvenience caused by recent events and assured me they were reviewing internal processes. Translation: they were trying to cover their butts before Lisa came after them too. But Karen? Oh no, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She started holding emergency HOA meetings at her house, which is technically against the rules, and rallying her loyal followers to support her crusade against me. She even sent out another round of flyers claiming that I was endangering community harmony by refusing to comply with reasonable requests. Reasonable requests? Lady, you called the cops on me at 3 a.m. Let's not pretend you're reasonable. And then came the final showdown. An official HOA hearing scheduled for 8 p.m. on a Friday night in the community clubhouse. The agenda? My truck, my lawn, and whether or not Karen had overstepped her authority as president. I showed up with Lisa by my side and a folder full of evidence proving that every single one of Karen's claims against me was either false or irrelevant. Meanwhile, Karen arrived with her clipboard army, 3 neighbors who looked like they'd been dragged there against their will, and a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Preserving Our Community Standards." Yes, really. The hearing started with Karen presenting her case against me in excruciating detail. She had slides showing photos of my truck from every angle, including one where it looked slightly dusty, and charts comparing my lawn to those of other houses on the street. Spoiler alert, mine wasn't even the worst. She talked about how my behavior was setting a dangerous precedent, and warned that if left unchecked, it could lead to widespread non-compliance. When it was my turn to speak, Lisa took over, and let me tell you, watching her dismantle Karen's arguments was like watching Picasso paint or Michael Jordan dunk. Pure artistry. She pointed out every flaw in Karen's claims using state law as her weapon of choice and even threw in some legal jargon just to make Karen squirm. By the time she finished speaking, half the board looked ready to vote me innocent just so they could go home. And vote they did unanimously in my favor. My truck stayed put. My lawn stayed patchy. And Karen? Well, let's just say she didn't stick around for refreshments after the meeting adjourned. As I walked out of that clubhouse victorious, with Lisa grinning like she just won an Oscar, I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for Karen. Not because she lost, she deserved that, but because she'd wasted so much time and energy fighting battles that never needed to be fought in the first place. But hey, That's life in an HOA neighborhood, where petty power struggles reign supreme and revenge is best served cold, preferably with legal backing. So, after the HOA hearing ended with Karen's humiliating defeat, you'd think that would have been the end of it. But no, Karen doesn't do defeat. She does denial, followed by damage control, and then a generous helping of delusional overreach. And while I was more than happy to bask in my victory, it turns out my little showdown with Karen had sparked something much bigger. A full-blown neighborhood rebellion. Started small, just whispers at first. Neighbors who'd been too scared or apathetic to stand up to Karen began talking amongst themselves. They shared stories about her ridiculous fines, her unsolicited advice on lawn care, and her tendency to show up unannounced with a clipboard and a bad attitude. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted by her reign of HOA terror. There was Steve down the street, who got fined for having an unauthorized bird feeder, and Linda, who received a warning because her garden hose wasn't coiled neatly enough. And let's not forget poor Jim, who got hit with a $50 penalty because his garage door was open for more than 15 minutes while he was unloading groceries. The more people talked, the angrier they got. It was like peeling back the layers of an onion, except instead of tears, it was pure outrage. And before long, those whispers turned into action. One morning, I woke up to find an email in my inbox from someone named Concerned Neighbor. It was an invitation to a secret meeting at Steve's house to discuss Karen's abuse of power and potential solutions. Potential solutions? Oh, this was going to be good. I showed up that evening expecting maybe 5 or 6 people, and found nearly half the neighborhood crammed into Steve's living room. There were retirees clutching printouts of HOA fines they'd received over the years, young couples venting about Karen's unsolicited parenting advice, and even a few kids who'd been yelled at for riding their bikes too fast on the sidewalk. It was like a support group for suburban survivors. Steve kicked off the meeting by handing out copies of our HOA bylaws, because apparently, Karen wasn't the only one who could weaponize paperwork. He pointed out several sections where Karen had overstepped her authority as president and suggested we petition for her removal. The room erupted in cheers. But then Linda chimed in with an even better idea. Why stop at removing Karen when we could overhaul the entire HOA? She proposed rewriting the bylaws to make them less restrictive and more focused on actual community issues, like fixing potholes or organizing events, instead of policing bird feeders and garden hoses. More cheers. And that's when Jim stood up with what can only be described as the ultimate mic drop moment. Why don't we just disband the HOA altogether? The room went silent for a second, and then exploded into applause so loud I thought Steve's windows might shatter. Now, disbanding an HOA isn't easy. It requires a majority vote from homeowners and some serious legal legwork. But suddenly it didn't seem impossible. People were fired up, ready to take back their neighborhood from Karen's iron grip. And I was more than happy to help lead the charge. Over the next few weeks, we organized like never before. We held meetings at different houses to avoid suspicion, because let's face it, Karen probably had spies. Created a private Facebook group to share updates and strategies, and even printed flyers encouraging neighbors to join our cause. The flyers featured a cartoon version of Karen holding her infamous clipboard with the caption, "Enough is enough. Take back our neighborhood." They were equal parts hilarious and effective. Of course, Karen caught wind of our rebellion eventually, because how could she not? She tried everything in her power to shut us down. She sent out mass emails warning residents about dangerous misinformation being spread by disgruntled individuals. She called emergency board meetings to discuss potential threats to community harmony. And she even hired some poor guy to go door to door handing out pamphlets titled, "Why HOAs Matter, Preserving Your Property Value." But here's the thing, people were done listening to Karen. Her credibility had taken such a hit after the hearing that even her most loyal followers started questioning her motives. And as more neighbors joined our movement, her power dwindled faster than an unplugged Roomba. Finally, after months of planning and organizing, we held a vote on whether to disband the HOA entirely, or at least remove Karen as president and rewrite the bylaws. The turnout was incredible. Practically every homeowner showed up, and when the results were announced, Well, let's just say Karen didn't take it well. She tried to argue that the vote was invalid due to some technicality about proxy ballots, because of course she did. But Lisa, my lawyer-turned-neighborhood hero, was there to shut her down with yet another citation from state law. The board officially voted to remove Karen as president effective immediately and began drafting new bylaws that prioritized actual community needs over petty rules. And as for disbanding the HOA altogether, well, that vote passed too, but it'll take some time before all the legal paperwork is finalized. In the meantime, though, one thing is clear. Karen's reign is over, and our neighborhood is finally free. As I stood on my porch that evening watching neighbors celebrate in their driveways, yes, including mine, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just about winning against Karen anymore. It was about reclaiming our sense of community from an outdated system that had done more harm than good. So here's to us, the suburban rebels who stood up against clipboard tyranny and won. Because if there's one thing this whole saga has taught me, it's that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet, it's downright revolutionary. So, with Karen officially dethroned and the HOA on the fast track to being disbanded, you'd think the story was over. But no, Karen wasn't done making a spectacle of herself. If anything, losing her precious clipboard crown seemed to amplify her melodramatic tendencies. It was like watching a soap opera unfold in real life, except instead of dramatic love triangles, it was all about lawn care and parking spaces. The first sign that Karen wasn't going quietly into the night came the morning after the vote. I woke up to find her standing in her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at anyone who dared make eye contact with her. She had erected a sign, yes, a literal sign, in her front yard that said, "This neighborhood deserves better," in bold red letters. It looked like something she'd whipped up at a craft store during a rage-fueled midnight session. And if that wasn't enough, she started handing out flyers to anyone who walked by, ranting about how the vote was illegitimate and how the neighborhood was descending into chaos. Chaos? Lady, people were literally planting flowers and chatting with their neighbors for the first time in years. If anything, the removal of Karen's iron grip had brought peace to our little suburb. But Karen wasn't interested in peace. She was interested in revenge, or at least some twisted version of it. Her next move was to start filing complaints with city officials about anything and everything she could think of. She reported Steve's backyard barbecue for excessive smoke, claimed Linda's garden hose was a safety hazard, and even tried to argue that Jim's garage door violated local building codes because it looked old. City inspectors started showing up so frequently that we joked about installing a coffee station for them. Of course, none of Karen's complaints went anywhere because they were all ridiculous. But that didn't stop her from trying. She even hired a lawyer. Well, more like a guy who advertises his services on bus benches, to send out cease and desist letters to anyone she deemed non-compliant. I got one accusing me of defamation because I called her birdbath hideous during the HOA hearing. Defamation? Over a birdbath? I framed the letter and hung it in my living room as a trophy. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood was thriving without Karen's interference. People started hosting block parties again, something that hadn't happened since Karen took over as HOA president, and kids were riding their bikes freely without fear of being scolded for reckless sidewalk behavior. Steve even organized a community cleanup day where we all pitched in to fix those potholes Karen had ignored for years while obsessing over garden gnomes. And then there was Linda, who became something of a local hero when she spearheaded an initiative to replace Karen's infamous flyers with cheerful posters promoting kindness and cooperation. My favorite one said, "Love thy neighbor, even if they have an ugly birdbath." It was subtle but effective. As for me, well, I decided to celebrate my newfound freedom by upgrading my truck. I traded in my old one for an even bigger model, one with shiny chrome wheels and enough horsepower to make Karen's Prius look like a golf cart. And yes, I parked it right in my driveway where everyone could see it. Karen, predictably, lost her mind. She started pacing past my house every day, muttering things like, "disgraceful," and "ruining property values." One time, she even stopped in front of my driveway and took photos from every angle while pretending to talk on her phone. I waved at her from my porch with a big grin on my face. It was petty, sure, but oh so satisfying. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. Karen's antics started backfiring spectacularly. The city officials she kept pestering finally got fed up and issued her a warning for filing frivolous complaints. Her lawyer apparently quit after realizing she wasn't paying him, shocking no one, and several neighbors began openly mocking her by creating fake HOA violation notices and taping them to her mailbox. One of them said, "Violation, excessive pouting in public spaces." Another read, "Infraction, unauthorized use of red ink on yard signs." And then came the piece de resistance. Princess, the yappy chihuahua who'd been running off-leash for years, finally got caught by animal control after wandering into Steve's backyard during one of his barbecues. Steve returned her unharmed because he's a decent human being, but not before snapping a photo of her sitting next to his grill looking guilty as sin. He posted it in our community Facebook group with the caption, "Violation, unauthorized attendance at backyard BBQs." The post went viral within hours. Karen tried to rally support by claiming Princess had been kidnapped, but no one took her seriously anymore, not even her former allies on the HOA board. By this point, most people were either ignoring her or actively avoiding her altogether. And then, she disappeared. One day, Karen's infamous yard sign vanished along with her flyers and daily pacing routine. Her house went quiet, eerily quiet, and rumors started swirling that she'd put it up for sale. Sure enough, within weeks there was a shiny new, "For sale" sign planted firmly in her front yard. When the moving truck finally arrived, half the neighborhood came out to watch like it was some kind of parade. People cheered as boxes were loaded onto the truck and waved goodbye as Karen drove away looking furious behind the wheel of her Prius. And just like that, she was gone. The neighborhood hasn't been the same since. And I mean that in the best possible way. Without Karen constantly breathing down our necks, people have started living their lives again. Planting gardens without fear of fines, hosting parties without worrying about parking spaces, and yes, parking trucks wherever they damn well please. As for me, well, I still have my big shiny truck parked proudly in my driveway, and every time I look at it, I can't help but smile knowing it represents more than just transportation. It represents freedom from clipboard tyranny, and proof that sometimes revenge is best served with chrome wheels and horsepower to spare. So here's to suburban rebellion, and here's to never letting another Karen take over again. So, with Karen officially banished from the neighborhood and her Prius packed off to some other unsuspecting suburb, life finally returned to normal, or at least as normal as it gets in a place where people once fought over the legality of garden gnomes. But let me tell you, the aftermath of Karen's reign wasn't just peaceful. It was downright glorious. It was like the HOA shackles had been removed, and suddenly everyone remembered how to smile again. First off, the neighborhood started looking, well, human. Gone were the cookie-cutter lawns trimmed with military precision. People started planting wildflowers and letting their grass grow a little longer without fear of Karen's clipboard brigade swooping in with violation notices. Steve turned his backyard into a full-on tiki paradise complete with string lights and a fire pit. Linda added a bright pink flamingo to her front yard just because she could. And Jim? Oh, Jim went all out. He painted his garage door bright yellow just to spite Karen's old complaints about its aged appearance. Even the kids got in on the action. They started chalking hopscotch grids on the sidewalks and riding their bikes like they were training for the Tour de France. One group even set up a lemonade stand right in front of Karen's old house, because nothing says we're free like selling sugary drinks on what used to be forbidden territory. And me? Well, I decided it was time to celebrate my victory in style. I threw a massive block party, the kind of party that would have given Karen an aneurysm if she'd still been around. We had barbecue ribs, burgers, and enough potato salad to feed an army. Steve brought his tiki torches. Linda brought her flamingo-themed napkins. And Jim showed up with a cooler full of beer and a grin so wide it could have powered the neighborhood streetlights. But here's the best part. We parked our cars everywhere. Driveways, curbs, even the grassy patch by the community mailbox, because why not? For one glorious evening, we turned parking chaos into an art form. And you know what? Not a single person complained. As the night went on, people started sharing stories about their run-ins with Karen over the years. There was the time she fined someone for having excessively loud wind chimes. Or the time she tried to ban Halloween decorations because they were too distracting. And let's not forget her infamous campaign against Steve's inflatable Santa Claus, which she claimed was a threat to community standards, despite being beloved by every kid on the block. By the end of the night, we were laughing so hard our sides hurt, and I realized something important. Karen might have made our lives miserable while she was here, but her departure had brought us closer together than ever before. It was like surviving a natural disaster and coming out stronger on the other side. Of course, not everything was perfect. Disbanding the HOA took longer than expected because, surprise! Karen had left behind a mountain of paperwork that needed sorting through. But thanks to Lisa, our resident legal superhero, we managed to untangle it all without too much drama. And once it was officially gone, oh man, it felt like winning the lottery. With no HOA breathing down our necks, people started getting creative with their newfound freedom. One neighbor built a treehouse so elaborate it looked like something out of Architectural Digest. Another installed solar panels shaped like sunflowers just because he thought they were cool. And me? Well, I upgraded my truck again. This time with custom decals that read Neighborhood Rebel on both doors. But here's what really surprised me. Even without an HOA enforcing rules, people didn't suddenly turn into chaos-loving maniacs. Sure, there were a few quirky lawn ornaments and some unconventional paint jobs, but overall, everyone kept things pretty reasonable. Turns out you don't need a clipboard dictator micromanaging your life to be a good neighbor. You just need mutual respect and maybe a few beers at Steve's Tiki Bar. As for Karen, well, rumor has it she moved to another HOA neighborhood across town, but this time as just another resident instead of president. I'd like to think she learned her lesson after everything that happened here. But honestly, I wouldn't bet on it. If there's one thing I've learned about Karens, it's that they're like weeds. They always find new ground to invade. So yeah, that's how my suburban revenge story ended. Not with bitterness or grudges, but with laughter, camaraderie, and one heck of a block party. And if there's one takeaway from all this madness, it's this: don't let anyone, not even an HOA president, tell you how to live your life on your own property. Now before I wrap this up, let me say one last thing. If you enjoyed hearing about my battle against clipboard tyranny, or if you've ever dealt with your own Karen-like nightmare, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with your friends, especially if they live in HOA neighborhoods. Drop a comment below telling me your own suburban horror stories, and hit that subscribe button for more tales of everyday rebellion. Because trust me, there are plenty more where this came from. Thanks for listening, and remember, always park your truck proudly in your driveway.